You call your dog's name. It looks at you for exactly 1 second, and then turns away. No tail wag. No trot toward you. Just a slow turn of the head, as if you weren't even there. Most owners feel it instantly. That quiet sting of rejection. Maybe it's upset with me. Maybe I did something wrong. But behavioral science has a completely different explanation. What your dog just did has nothing to do with your bond. What's actually happening is one of the most sophisticated emotional self-regulation systems in the animal kingdom, and most owners punish it. In the 1990s, a Norwegian dog trainer named Turid Rugas began noticing something most people had completely overlooked. She was watching dogs interact, not in training sessions but in open fields, in parks, in backyards, and she kept seeing the same behaviors. A dog would look away just as another dog approached. One would yawn slowly, while another circled nearby. A third would lie down, mid-interaction, for no obvious reason. And every time, the tension in the space immediately dropped. She spent 3 decades documenting over 30 of these behaviors. She called them calming signals, a language dogs use to prevent conflict and reduce stress. Turning the head away, licking the nose, blinking slowly, walking in a curve instead of straight toward something, freezing, yawning, sniffing the ground. These aren't random behaviors. They're deliberate communication, refined over thousands of years of social living with both humans and other dogs. And here's the part most owners miss. Dogs don't just use these signals with other dogs. They use them with you. When you call your dog's name in a high, excited voice, and it looks away, that look away is a calming signal directed at you. It's not saying, "I don't care." It's saying, "I need a moment. This feels like too much right now." When you walk quickly toward your dog, and it turns its face to the side, same thing. It's asking you, in its own language, to slow down. When it yawns right as you start raising your voice, not because it's tired, because it's trying to de-escalate the situation before it goes any further. These are not signs of a broken bond. They are signs of an active one. Rugas documented these signals across hundreds of dogs of different breeds, backgrounds, and training histories. The language was consistent. The intention was always the same. The goal, in every case, reduce tension, create safety, and communicate something important without resorting to aggression. And the dogs that use these signals most fluently, the ones that yawn, look away, sniff the ground at exactly the right moment, are often the most socially intelligent. They've learned that communication works better than conflict. That space is a gift, not a punishment. If your dog walks in a curve toward you rather than straight, that's a calming signal. It's approaching you in the least threatening way it knows. If it sniffs the ground right as you call it, it's not distracted. It's processing, grounding itself before deciding how to respond. These signals are subtle, easy to miss if you don't know what to look for. But once you see them, you cannot unsee them. You'll start noticing them everywhere, at the dog park, during training, in your living room when you accidentally raise your voice. And every single time, the message is the same. Not "I don't love you," but "I need you to meet me where I am." And if you've ever called your dog and watched it look away, you've already been on the receiving end of this language. You just didn't have the words for it yet. There's another reason your dog might not respond when you call, and it has nothing to do with calming signals or emotional communication. It has to do with the sheer volume of information your dog is processing at any given moment, in ways that are almost impossible for humans to imagine. A dog's sense of smell is between 10,000 and 100,000 times more powerful than yours. A dog's hearing can detect frequencies up to 65,000 Hz, more than 3 times the upper limit of human hearing. At any moment, your dog is receiving data from the environment that you are completely invisible to. Sounds from several streets away. Scents from hours ago still hanging in the air. When that sensory input reaches a certain threshold, when the environment becomes overwhelming, your dog's nervous system shifts into what researchers call a high arousal state. In that state, the brain prioritizes environmental processing. It is scanning, sorting, assessing. Everything else, including your voice, gets deprioritized. A study from the University of Veterinary Medicine, Vienna, published in 2021, found something that should change the way every dog owner thinks about obedience. When dogs were in a high arousal state, their responsiveness to verbal commands dropped significantly, regardless of how well trained they were, regardless of how strong their bond with their owner. This wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't defiance. It was neurology. Think about the last time you were in the middle of something deeply absorbing, a deadline, a difficult conversation, something that had your complete attention. Someone called your name from across the room. Maybe you heard it. Maybe you didn't respond immediately. Not because you didn't care, because your brain was fully elsewhere. Your dog experiences this, but multiplied by a nervous system that is calibrated for survival, not for living rooms and verbal commands. When you call your dog and it doesn't come, it may not be choosing to ignore you. It may genuinely be elsewhere, cognitively, sensorially, neurologically. And when you respond by calling louder or walking toward it with frustration in your voice, you add more sensory input to an already overloaded system. You're not breaking through the noise. You're adding more noise to a brain that is already running at capacity. The dog that looks at you and turns away in that moment isn't broken. It's managing. It's doing exactly what a healthy nervous system does under load. Self-regulation isn't failure. In dogs as in humans, the ability to pause, reset, and return is one of the most important capacities a healthy mind can have. This is why experienced trainers will tell you, if your dog isn't responding, the first question isn't, how do I make it listen? It's, what is it currently processing? Give it a moment. Let the arousal level come down naturally. Then call again, calmly, once, with a tone that invites rather than demands. The dog that gets space when it needs it learns that returning to you is safe. The dog that gets corrected during overload learns that your voice means pressure. Over time, one of those dogs will come running every time you call. The other will start looking away before you even open your mouth. The difference isn't training method. It's whether you understood what was happening underneath the behavior before you decided how to respond to it. Here's the part of this that most people don't expect. The part that seems counterintuitive until you hear the science behind it. A dog that occasionally ignores you, that turns away, that doesn't come immediately, that sits quietly in the other room, is often the dog that trusts you most. Not the dog that follows you everywhere. Not the dog that watches your every move. The one that sometimes just exists alongside you. Researchers at Monash University, studying attachment patterns in domestic dogs, identified a clear distinction between what they called secure and anxious attachment styles. Securely attached dogs would explore freely, self-regulate, and return to their owners on their own schedule. They were confident. They were calm. Anxiously attached dogs, by contrast, stayed close, monitored their owner's every movement, and struggled to settle unless physical contact was maintained. The anxiously attached dogs looked, on the surface, like they loved their owners more. They were always there, always watching, always needing. But the securely attached dogs, the ones who could take space, who could sit across the room without anxiety, showed deeper, more stable bonds over time. Because secure attachment isn't about constant proximity. It's about knowing that proximity is available whenever you need it. Your dog doesn't need to be next to you every second to love you. It needs to know that if it comes to you, you will be safe, consistent, and predictable. When a dog can turn away from you without fear, without worrying that you'll react with anger or punishment, that calm is built on something real. It's built on a history of you being steady, of you not overreacting, of you being, in the language of attachment research, a secure base. Think about that in human terms. The people you feel most comfortable around aren't the ones you perform for. They're the ones you can be quiet with. The friendships where silence doesn't feel awkward, where you can be in the same room doing completely different things and feel completely at ease. That's what your dog is doing when it looks away and settles on the other side of the room. It's being at ease with you. The dog that ignores you sometimes is often the dog that trusts you most. The research on secure attachment also tells us these dogs are more resilient. They recover faster from stress, they're easier to train, and they show fewer behavioral problems over time. That resilience comes directly from knowing they have a safe base to return to. You, specifically. Not just anyone in the room. When your dog ignores you and then, 5 minutes later, wanders over and leans against your leg, that sequence is the secure attachment cycle in action. Space. Then return, not because it was told to, not because it was anxious, because it wanted to. That is what trust looks like from the inside. And you now know exactly what you're looking at when you see it. None of this means you should ignore every instance of your dog not responding. Context matters. And there are specific patterns worth paying attention to. The calming signals we've talked about, the head turns, the yawns, the lookaways, are active, fluid behaviors. Your dog is present, aware, and communicating. What looks different is a dog that has gone quiet in a way that feels heavier. That isn't just avoiding a moment. It's withdrawing from everything. If your dog stops responding to stimuli it normally reacts to, its name, the sound of a leash, the smell of food it usually loves, and this change is accompanied by low energy, changes in appetite, or unusual sleep patterns, that is worth a conversation with your vet. and older dogs especially. This kind of broad unresponsiveness can be an early sign of canine cognitive dysfunction, a condition similar to dementia, affecting memory, awareness, and sensory processing. The ASPCA distinguishes clearly between what it calls shutdown behavior and a calming signal. One is communication. The other is a symptom. There's also a third pattern worth understanding. If your dog has never reliably responded to basic commands, even in calm, low distraction environments, that isn't always a calming signal or sensory overload. It may be a training history that made your voice something to move away from rather than toward. Dogs that have been corrected harshly for not responding or called in order to be punished for something learn quickly that coming when called is not always safe. That pattern can be unlearned. But it requires recognizing that the behavior isn't defiance. It's a learned association. And from the dog's perspective, a very reasonable one, and knowing the difference between these three patterns, calming signals, sensory overload, and conditioned avoidance, is what lets you respond to your dog instead of just reacting to it. Shifts the question from, how do I make my dog listen, to what does my dog actually need right now? And the answer to that question turns out to be the foundation of almost every strong human-dog relationship. Not perfect commands. Not perfect obedience. The ability to read what's happening beneath the behavior and meet your dog there. That requires slowing down. It requires observing before reacting. It requires treating your dog's behavior as information rather than as a challenge to your authority. Most behavioral issues that owners describe, a dog that doesn't come, that seems distant or unresponsive, are not issues with the dog's love or loyalty. They're mismatches in communication. Your dog has been speaking. You've just been missing what it was saying. And now you know how to start listening. So go back to that moment. The one we started with. You call your dog's name. It looks at you for 1 second and turns away. This time, you see it differently. You see a dog that is managing its own nervous system, communicating in the only language it has. You see calming signals. You see self-regulation. You see a creature that trusts you enough to be honest about what it needs in that moment. And maybe a few minutes later it wanders over to you, not because it was called, not because it was corrected, but because it wanted to. Because you are its safe base. Its secure attachment figure. The constant in an environment that is always, relentlessly, asking something of its senses. That's what this behavior has always been telling you. Not distance between you. Safety because of you. Here is what the science tells us, consistently, across studies on attachment, sensory processing, and canine communication. The strongest human-dog bonds are not the ones where the dog is always watching, always waiting, always performing loyalty on demand. They're the ones where the dog can rest. Where it can exist without anxiety. Where it knows, without constant reassurance, that you are there. That kind of bond doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't look like the dogs in movies who follow their owners to the ends of the earth. It looks like a dog that can sleep in the other room, that can take a moment before it comes when called, that can sometimes just be. And in those quiet, ordinary moments, in the look away, the slow yawn, the calm return, it's telling you everything you need to know. It feels safe. It feels known. And in a relationship between two different species, trying to understand each other across that distance, that is everything. Your dog doesn't ignore you. It trusts you enough not to perform. There's a difference between a dog that has to stay close because it's afraid of what happens when it doesn't, and a dog that chooses to come back because it wants to. One of those dogs is driven by anxiety. The other is driven by connection. And you now know exactly which one you're looking at. If that reframed the way you see your dog, subscribe. There's a lot more where that came from, and it only gets more interesting from here. Drop a comment below. Tell me one moment when you thought your dog was ignoring you. I'd genuinely love to know what it was actually doing instead. And if you want to understand what your dog is saying when it stares at you, holding eye contact for just a little too long, that video is next. And the science behind it is even stranger than you'd expect.